All right, so we're back for another lecture for GWS 200. This is one of two lectures for this week. The title of this lecture is Intro to Transnational Feminist Cultural Studies. So you should have that slideshow pulled up. And the slideshow is 15 slides in total, including the title slide, which is where you should be right now. So we're going to go ahead and dive in. So turning now to slide 2, the first content slide of the lecture. We're going to begin by talking about transnational feminism, which is a term you might have encountered in readings already, or you might have heard me say maybe once or twice briefly during lecture, but we haven't really talked about it too much in depth. So transnational feminism is a branch of feminist scholarship, but also a type of activism. So when you say transnational feminism, and don't really clarify what it means, it probably means a general kind of disposition, a set of sort of assumptions and attitudes about the world that guide transnational feminism broadly, and those assumptions and attitudes manifest differently if it's in the world of scholarship or if it's in the world of activism. Now, in any case, transnational feminism is concerned with gender and with identity broadly, so not just with gender, but with race, with sex, with class, with ability, with age, with religion, with nationality, with ethnicity, and so many other identity categories. And the reason is because transnational feminism, from its inception, has always been kind of an intersectional endeavor. And remember, when we use the term intersectional, we're talking about the ways in which our experiences of our various identities intersect with our experiences of other ones. So when I go out in the world, I go out in the world not just as a man one day and then as a white person a different day, but my experiences of the world are always experiencing the world through all of my identities. And intersectionality also helps us think about systemic oppression because it tells us that different systems of oppression like racism and sexism, right, that they work oftentimes in intersection with one another. So they'll be working in unison with one another, though other times, of course, they conflict with each other, but that's the point of intersectional analysis. In addition, transnational feminism, as opposed to, let's say, just US-based feminism, is sensitive to differences of nation and location. So nation being about your nationality, relating to your citizenship, to where you were born, to where you have legal status, and also location being important to this question too, though not necessarily the same thing as nation. Yes, most of us are located in the nation of our nationalities. However, your location might be different than your nationality, and regardless of the case, where you're located has a huge impact on how you experience, let's say, different systems of oppression, or just experiences in general. So, transnational feminism further is concerned with globalization, with global capitalism, and with neoliberalism as being both a set of institutional practices and an economic ideology about how the world should work. That is kind of the best way of encapsulating and capturing what modern global capitalism looks like. Further, and to kind of reference back to stuff we're already familiar with from this class, transnational feminism is critical of cultural imperialism, and it's critical of neocolonization, neocolonialism broadly. Um, and finally, as both a scholarly and an academic endeavor, transnational feminism is focused on building bridges, building connections across locational divides. So, in terms of academic work, we're looking at types of collaboration between different institutions in different countries. And in terms of activism, we're thinking about kind of coalitions that are built across distance. And while in this lecture, we're going to focus more on kind of the scholarly approach to transnational feminism and then specifically transnational feminist cultural studies, in the other lecture for this week focused on Arabic hip hop, there's a lot more discussion of what transnational feminist activism looks like. So turning to the next slide now, slide 3. As a scholarly field, transnational feminism emerged in the 1970s and the 1980s as a critique of academic trends at a particular moment in time. So this moment was a moment of increased globalization, or to think of it transnationally, this kind of this moment of decreasing significance or role of the nation state and national borders. This was a time of increased movement of goods, of people, of services, of ideas, cultural practices, etc. globally, right? So this is a moment that a lot of transnational feminist scholars were really writing to or writing about. about. Now, as a field, transnational feminism, it wasn't by any means the first branch of feminism that dealt with kind of the question of global issues. There were already two branches of feminism that were really popular at the time, one of which being global feminism and one of which being intersectional feminism. But transnational feminism was critical of both. So first off, it was critical of global feminism as a field because it had this characteristic of these notions of global sisterhood, right? These ideas of global sisterhood or universal sisterhood, that all women around the world are kind of naturally aligned together and have this sort of, kind of like assumed to be natural alliance and universal experience of womanhood under sexism, right? So this kind of argument that all women were bound together by their shared experience of living under sexism all over the world, right? Now, transnational feminism was really critical of this notion of global sisterhood or universal sisterhood, saying that paying attention to a politics of location, of nation, of ethnicity, paying attention to questions of citizenship, of migration status, of legal status, right? These were all really, really important things to consider when approaching the topic of women, right, and of women's issues, so much so that notions of universal sisterhood or global sisterhood seemed unrealistic, right? And also seemed to kind of mask or help to cover up a lot of these important differences between women that help determine or help structure their experiences of sexism. So then the next field that transnational feminism was really critical of was international feminism, and this was because of international feminism's reliance on the nation state as a unit of analysis. And the critique that we saw come from transnational feminism kind of had two major prongs to it. The first was that right now there is this decreasing role of the nation or of the nation state or of the notion of national borders in political, economic, and cultural affairs. And then second off, that through this kind of strict focus on the nation state as a unit of analysis, we had the strong possibility in international feminism of kind of essentializing women's experiences of oppression, experiences of sexism within a particular nation state as being universally the same, right? Oh, so all women from Afghanistan experience sexism like this. All women from, even on a broader regional level, all women from the Middle East, right, experience sexism in this particular way. And so transnational feminists were pretty critical of these tendencies. It's not to say that all work happening in global feminism or international feminism had this exact thing happening within it, but that enough of it was that transnational feminists felt the need to kind of name what they were doing and carve it out as being distinct from those other fields. So moving on to the next slide, slide 4. As a field, transnational feminists have been interested in many issues. Some of the main ones including global gender inequality, and here we're talking about both inequality in terms of human rights or women's rights, but also economic inequality and the way in which poverty is feminized, and poverty is this thing that has huge global ramifications, so that the global south is comparatively poor and the global north is comparatively rich, and men are comparatively wealthy and women are comparatively poor, and these two things come together, right? The next thing about hegemonic gender norms becoming globalized, something we're already familiar with through kind of notions of cultural imperialism and westernization taking place. Think back to Connell's article on globalized masculinities and hegemonic masculinity that emerges from the West. So broadly, this question of women's and humans' rights also is very important. On an economic level, paying attention to the ideology and practices of global capitalism, and specifically neoliberalism, questions of war and militarism and the way in which those affect women differently than men, the questions of women's health, so sexual health, reproductive health, general health, and how these the disparities in terms of women's access to comprehensive health coverage are oftentimes global affairs that kind of reflect global power differences. And then finally, the question of immigration. And I choose to end with the question of immigration because if you turn to the next slide now, slide 5, the discussions of immigration that we've seen within the field of transnational feminism really reveal a lot about its various assumptions as a field. So one of the assumptions or one of the kind of discussions that we see emerge in transnational feminist approaches to immigration is that our experience experiences of national, gendered, sexual, and other identities are wrapped up in processes of globalization, of neoliberalism, and of the international exchange of various sorts of things, right? Of ideas, of products, of people, and what have you. So, this kind of idea that, let's say, someone's gender identity is no longer this matter of personal decision or even a matter of kind of just a local sort of culture that they're immersed in, a local society that they're immersed in, but really that how we identify ourselves through gender is very much now built into processes of globalization or affected by processes of globalization, affected by neoliberalism, affected by cultural imperialism, depending on where you live, right? And definitely affected by globalization, by international exchange of goods, of ideas, what have you. So, and when transnational feminists talk about the experiences of immigrants, right, fundamentally their experiences of or of national identity, right, of ethnicity, and even of gender and sexuality and age and religion, they're all kind of affected by the process of immigrating, the process of migration, and that the process of migration is entirely a global matter, right? A matter of transnationalism, internationalism, or globalism, depending on how you look at it, right? So next, the second assumption we see is that migrants' lives, that migrants' lives, yeah, are affected or structured by having multiple subjectivities as they navigate lives in both their new and home cultures. So many transnational feminist scholars who've written about immigration have focused on, for example, the experience of immigrants within, let's say, the United States. And you might think about the article that we read earlier in the semester, Americans Have a Different Attitude by Yenli Espiritu, about the experience of Filipino migrants in the United States and their attitudes around sexuality. If you think about that article, it really kind of captures the way in which immigrants live or navigate subjectivities in two worlds at once, right? So their experience as migrants in the United States isn't just structured by living in the United States, but is structured by simultaneously navigating their home culture and their culture where they're currently living in the US, right? Um, so next, another assumption that we see emerge from the field is that histories of colonialism and global power imbalances really structure modern experiences of globalization and of movement, right? So globalization, we're thinking about new movements of goods, of people, ideas, services, etc. That old histories of colonialism and imperialism continue to structure experiences of globalization, right? Now we can say that that has obvious kind of reference back to what we've already learned about cultural imperialism and neo-colonization, and both this is both true in terms of new processes of colonization and of cultural imperialism that are taking place, but this is also true the statement that these histories of colonialism and histories of imperialism affect modern day experiences of globalization. This is also true because a lot of the institutions that we still have that dictate how processes of globalization unfold were built and were structured during a period of colonization and imperialism, right? So these institutions, these political institutions, right, these economic institutions still are structured around the experiences of imperial nations during that time period. And then finally, that processes of globalization or transnationalism do not inherently challenge systems of oppression, but often work to reinforce and expand their effects, right? This goes back to what we've talked about previously, that we need to get past this idea that globalization is this like amazing thing that's taking place, right? Oftentimes it's touted that way, that globalization is about progress, it's about exchange, right? It's about innovation, it's about hybridity and mixing, right? And to a degree, a lot of this is true, which is to say that globalization certainly makes a lot of these things possible in new ways that they weren't before. But to say that globalization wholly produces better societies, better livelihoods, better quality of life for all people all over the world is not only wrong, but it could actually be the opposite of the truth, right? The opposite of, let's say, the aggregate, the average that we're seeing in terms of how globalization, broadly written, has affected the world, right? We've seen an exaggeration of power imbalances, an exaggeration of differences of wealth between the global north and the global south, an exaggeration of environmental degradation in the global south as a result of industrialization in the global north. I mean, there's so many things that we could name, right? And even if we think about something as seemingly utopic or seemingly open and accessible as the internet, right? Even the avenues, right? The circuits of cultural exchange that take place over the web typically reflect this sort of ongoing process of cultural imperialism. So moving on to the next slide, right? To really get to the meat of this class, we might ask, how does culture enter into this transnational feminism question, right? Where do we fit culture into transnational feminism? Because so far, everything we've talked about in regards to transnational feminism seems as though it is kind of like existing in this transnational or global political realm, right? So we can answer this question first by asking ourselves, well, what do we already broadly know about feminist approaches to culture from this class, from just our general knowledge of the world? Well, for one, culture is equally important to economic or political realms and actually really interacts and overlaps with them. So to a degree, talking about the political or the economic, right, as distinct from the cultural is a bit wrong, right? It actually doesn't capture the fact that ideologies, institutions, and individual behaviors don't operate within one of those realms at a time. Oftentimes they're interacting with all those realms simultaneously, right? Which is to say that you can have an individual behavior that has economic, cultural, and political effects, right, and influences. You can have an institutional practice which is much the same, that affects economic, political, and cultural realms, etc., etc. So, the next thing that we already know about feminism and about culture and about identity is that culture is a site of power, both in terms of reinforcing and challenging systematic oppression. Next, we know that culture is everywhere. There is no outside of culture. No matter where you are, no matter what you're doing, you're navigating one or multiple cultures at a single time. Next, we know that culture is reconstructed through a range of practices. So, at the point that we're born, culture already exists, right? We're already born into it. But that's not to say that it's static. Over the course of our lifetime, the cultures we're in are constantly changing, constantly being reconstructed through practices that people participate in, through practices that people drive. And then finally, and really importantly, is that our identities are reconstructed largely through cultural imaginaries, right? Cultural imaginaries being these sorts of, immaterial spaces, sets of practices through which people within a particular group manage to discuss or communicate about and to contest what it means to identify in a particular way. So we're on to our next slide, slide 7 now. So Transnational Feminist Cultural Studies essentially picks up on all of these insights from the previous slide, but locates them in a transnational moment, right? And essentially insists that this global moment, this transnational moment, is important to considering all of those topics. So essentially, Transnational Feminist Cultural Studies does to culture the same thing we saw done to immigration within transnational feminism when we just discussed it. Basically, it makes culture about identity in a transnational or global moment. To put it differently, it kind of adds an additional layer or additional scale or additional context for thinking about systemic power, culture, and resistance to oppression. So moving on to slide 8, we could say that transnational feminist cultural studies, if we really want to hammer it down and define it, is a framework or a methodology for discussing cultural practices and identity in a moment of transnationalism and global exchange. So that's a real mouthful. Let's kind of unpack it. Now, a framework essentially is a way of looking at the world. It's a way of saying, okay, so this is how I believe the world works. Here's different components of it. Here's how they interact together. And based off of that approach, that conceptualization of the world, I'm going to interact with it in a particular way. On a scholarly level, I'm going to write about it in a particular way. On an activist level, I'm going to organize around it in a particular way based off of my framework for how the world works, right? And the term methodology is essentially a way of connecting theory and practice, right, through a framework. So methodology will say both, I think the world operates in this way, and therefore I'm going to write about it, right, or research and write about it in a particular way. And now, specifically, Transnational Feminist Cultural Studies is a framework for writing about cultural practices and identity in a transnational moment, right? So it centers the role of the transnational or the role of this global moment in any sort of discussion of cultural practice and identity. So for Gillian Sandel, one of the authors who we're reading for this week, she writes, by Transnational Feminist Cultural Studies, I refer to a methodology articulated through a series of essays by Inderpaul Gruel and Karen Kaplan that analyze the social and political significance of cultural practices produced within the context of globalization and that critically engage the category of the nation state, right? So we see two things happening in this definition from Sandel. Now, before I get to those two things, it's important that she introduces Inderpaul Gruel and Karen Kaplan, who are two really important figures in transnational feminism and who have really helped kind of define what transnational feminist cultural studies is about and what it can do. And so their work and their work through which Sandel is articulating this definition of transnational feminist cultural studies, um, uh, they've been able to do two things. So first off, they're looking at cultural practices produced within the context of globalization. So they have this question of globalization as really central to their analysis. And then next, you also see at the end of their definition that this question of critically engaging the category of the nation state. So this really goes back to our definition of what transnational is, right? The transnational refers to this moment where the role of the nation state, of national borders, is changing and even decreasing within the political and cultural and economic realms in terms of how people experience the world, right? Experience power, experience all these different things. So for Sandel and for Gruel and for Kaplan and for our class, this kind of transnational moment is really critical to understanding the question of identity, right? Because as these national borders change in terms of their significance in all these different ways, right, so do the ways in which they end up affecting and constructing our identities, right? So if we think about something like gender, right? You could say that there was a time, and that there certainly still is a time, where ideas about how to do our gender are kind of constructed at the level of the nation, right? So, how I do my gender is a very, let's say, American way to do masculinity. However, as the role of the nation state in determining, right, what gender looks like changes and maybe even decreases, then we start to see this sort of, globalization of masculinity, globalization of femininity emerging from the West, right? And that's as a hegemonic thing, as this form of cultural imperialism. But we also see a lot of kind of radical potential offered up by people being able to start to define their gender in ways that go beyond these sort of national conventions. So, moving to the next slide now, slide 9. Transnational feminist studies as a framework, right, as a methodology, as a field, has brought attention to several important topics in the transnational moment. So one thing is the exclusion of women from global or transnational processes that parallels to their former exclusion from the nation state. So again, this kind of harkens back to this idea that the transnational or the moment of globalization isn't this utopic moment that's challenging power relations and fundamentally unsettling them and leading to new progress and new rights and this sort of notion of like this upward sort of narrative of progress, right? But that actually the transnational moment is including women in ways that parallel their exclusion from the nation state, right? So women aren't necessarily now included in dramatically different ways that they weren't previously because of this decreasing role of the nation state, right? In fact, you can make an argument that the world of transnational politics and transnational economics, right, or global economics, is very much a male dominated world. So the next thing we see is that the unique position of women as laborers in the global chains of capitalist production has merited considerable attention within transnational feminist cultural studies. So as in this moment of globalization, where we see this sort of globalization of industry, we also see this kind of growing ability for Western corporations to devalue labor in the global South. And when combined with sexist attitudes that render women's labor even cheaper than men's labor, you see this kind of unique position of women within the kind of global chains of capitalist production that gives them insight into particular cultural and political and economic dimensions of globalization, that also then give them this sort of powerful position to be able to produce cultural knowledge about it and to be able to organize against it. So the next thing we see focused on in transnational feminist cultural studies is the important role of cultural practices and production as a form of survival in the transnational moment, right? So if we're assuming that the transnational moment or this moment of globalization actually is exaggerating power and differences and therefore exaggerating experiences of oppression and marginalization, making them worse, right? Then methods of survival become very important, and culture is one site where we see a whole bunch of practices taking place that are done as means of survival, right? And then the next thing we see also, going beyond this question of survival, but even into the question of intentionally constructed resistance, we could say that cultural practices or cultural production and consumption play really important roles in the construction of coalitions and construction of resistant movements. So those are some of the big takeaways that we get from transnational feminist cultural studies. Moving on to the next slide now, slide 10. We can now kind of turn to thinking about how you as students can engage this question of transnational feminist cultural studies, right? So how do you begin looking at something like a cultural artifact or a cultural practice and kind of analyze it to engage in inquiry that reflects some of the assumptions of transnational feminist cultural studies? So first off, you want to, of course, identify what the cultural practice or artifact you are dealing with is, kind of it's roughly trying to define it, who participates in it, and who it affects. When you're thinking about who participates in it, think about the different ways that people participate in a particular practice or a particular culture or a particular, even with a particular artifact. So next you want to be attentive to the context of the practice. So what year is it being practiced? Where? Under what social, political, and economic conditions? Now this involves thinking about racism, about classism, about sexism, and other systems of oppression under which the practice is taking place, right? So, and we'll in a moment we'll go and we'll kind of think about this in terms of stuff we already have learned about from the class. But finally, you want to locate the practice in a global context. So, is the practice influenced by factors not located where the practice is taking place? Is the practice involving people across a large distance in different places? Does the practice affect people really removed from where the practice is taking place? So, when you begin to ask all these questions, you can start to engage in transnational feminist cultural analysis. So let's take the question of the hijab, right? Something we're already really familiar with from this class, and try applying this sort of line of questioning to it. So first off, we want to identify what the cultural practice or artifact you're dealing with is. So obviously the artifact is the hijab, but when we're thinking about this as a cultural practice, we could talk about the art of wearing or donning the hijab, right? Or sorry, the practice of wearing or donning this hijab, right? And so now who participates in it? We could say that the women who wear hijab participate in it. Their friends and family members, people in their community, they are all participate in it. Even if those people aren't putting the hijab on themselves, they're all kind of involved in the practice in various ways. And who does it affect? So it affects the person wearing the hijab, people who interact with them. It even affects people who just witness them, right, in public spaces. And yeah, so we've kind of like started to define what it means, the practice itself being the act of donning hijab. So next we want to be attentive to the context of the practice. So what year is it being practiced, right? We're talking about in the current moment. Most of the literature we looked at this semester deals with kind of the contemporary moment. So where? Well, let's focus this in so we can really think about what practice we're talking about. Because talking about putting on the hijab just as this general practice that's the same everywhere in the world, of course, doesn't make sense. We already know in this class that's not something we'd want to be doing. So let's focus it in on the West, right? So we're thinking about women donning hijab in Western countries, in the United States and Canada, let's say, because we're already familiar with those, and maybe we'll think about France too as we're working through this whole kind of thing, right? So under what social, political, and economic conditions? Okay, well, in most places in the West, we see pretty strong levels of Islamophobia, oftentimes specifically directed towards aesthetic expressions of Islam, right, through dress or hair or hijab. Politically, right now in the United States and in the UK and even in Canada, we've seen political measures taken to target people from Arab and from Islamic backgrounds. And Yeah. All right. So that might all be it. And then on the economic side of things, maybe there's research out there showing that people who wear hijab in the United States or in Canada or in France are less likely to get hired for a particular job. I'd be willing to believe that that is the case. Although I haven't read any specific research done on that topic, I wouldn't be surprised if it's out there. Right. So then finally, let's locate this practice in a global context. So is the practice influenced by factors not located where the practice is taking place? Well, certainly, right? Ideas about the hijab and about Islam in this current moment are totally global ideas. Debates about them, discourses around them circulate globally as people from all over the world participate in them at the same time. Additionally, right, there is a history to the hijab which goes back to specific places that are still around and still have cultural practices tied to the hijab, right? So the decision of women in, let's say, the United States to wear or to not wear hijab is certainly affected by ideas that emerge from places outside of the United States, right? Now, let's look at the next question. Is a practice involving people across a large distance? Well, no matter how we scale this down, the answer is certainly yes, right? Even if we're just thinking about women who wear hijab in the United States, right? Or even just women who wear hijab in California or southern Arizona, we're still thinking about pretty long distances, right? Long enough distances that not all these people could possibly know one another, right? In different places, certainly. Now, finally, does a practice affect people removed from where the practice is taking place? We could probably say yes to this question too, right? Even though we're talking about women who are wearing hijab in the United States, right? It affects women, right? And affects people in other parts of the world, but also even within the United States. Let's say a woman is choosing to wear hijab anywhere in the country, right? It seems as though, based off of the reactions of politicians, right, many of whom would look to criminalize the wearing of the hijab, right, that their decision does in some sort of way affect them, right? And this kind of demonstrates the cultural level of the hijab as a practice, right? Culture is something that ties people together on a level that might not have any material basis to it, right? So, in other words, you can have politicians in the United States who feel that it's their duty and responsibility to take issue with or be bothered by women who wear hijab in the United States because they see there as being this kind of shared cultural space, right? The shared cultural imaginary that we're all participating in and that we're all kind of fighting over, right? In terms of what it means to be an American, and that they, as a politician, therefore, being in the shared cultural imaginary with anybody who lives in the United States, has a right to be able to make claims about what women should or should not wear, right? Um, and again, you'll notice all these claims come from a position of like, this is the United States, this is our value system, this is what we should or should not have, right? So transnational feminist cultural studies allows us to take something that's happening, let's say at a particularly local or specific level, right? Again, if we're thinking about this question of the hijab, right, a lot of people could kind of think of it as just being this sort of like individual level question. And we're able to locate it within kind of global processes. We're able to then scale or to move between scales, right? And sometimes we use the term translocal to be able to define this, your ability to take something that looks like it's kind of contained at this local level and to locate it within these kind of larger and larger processes, levels of power, levels of kind of social and political and economic organization. So moving on to the next slide here, slide 11. Um, Really, to kind of continue this line of thought, it's amazing what transnational feminist cultural studies can help reveal about the world. As a field, transnational feminist cultural studies is really ever more important because concerns and ideas about gender and sexuality have a global scope and circulate like never before. So, some of the examples that we could kind of point to that are really important to take note of is the way in which contemporarily women's rights are used as a signal or a benchmark of development, of progress, of westernization, right? So that countries that do not have what are touted as kind of developed modern women's rights regimes are seen as being inherently underdeveloped, backwards, kind of like behind in terms of progress, and all these other things, right? This can really problematically connect into Orientalist and other sort of cultural imperialist ideologies about the global South. But it's interesting that that really is something that for a lot of countries they have to come to terms with to be seen as being like a modern or developed country through a range of institutions and just kind of various perspectives. Next, we see the same thing beginning to happen with LGBT rights as kind of a signal of development or of progress. Um, those are important to consider when we're thinking about analyzing gender and analyzing sexuality in a global moment because women's rights and LGBT rights are oftentimes used in order to justify war or other sorts of international intervention, right? So we've talked about this before in this class that women oftentimes are used as a reason to go to war. That we see these narratives about like going to the Middle East to save women from the horrors of Oriental sexism, right? Oriental patriarchy is kind of the way in which this is constructed in the news and narrated. Um, Finally, or not finally, but in addition, and kind of to change the turn away from this question of human rights and of their relationship to war, the growth of global media and communication channels for spreading ideas about gender and sexuality, and to be more specific, the cultural imperialism that those media channels then allow of Western hetero and homonormativity and Western kind of hegemonic masculinity and femininity as they're being exported to other places around the world, largely made possible because of the fact that these media channels themselves are owned by Western corporations, and because the international political and economic institutions that determine what globalization looks like are largely controlled by Western nations too. So, turning on to the next slide, and to kind of really bring it all back to the question of this course, right? Women in Western culture. Transnational Feminist Cultural Studies is really important for thinking about the topic of the course and really interrogating it, right? So first off, Transnational Feminist Cultural Studies would, as we have, challenged the notion of a clearly defined West or a clear category of Western culture, right? This is because the imbrication of disparate parts of the world politically, socially, economically, and culturally makes that idea just completely impossible to defend, right? No matter how you try and think about it, right? The idea of being in or not in Western culture is really hard to clearly define. Now, you could say that there are people who live halfway across the world from the US who are online and on social media, right, and consuming culture in ways that allow them to almost appear as or be more American in terms of their cultural practices and their cultural expression than people living in the United States themselves, right? So the idea that geography defines what culture we're in is kind of out the window, right? But at the same time, knowledge can't define it either. You can't say that the person who lives in the United States lives outside of American culture, and this person halfway across the world who's on the internet all the time reading about the US, right, and writing about the US is in US culture, right? Geography is still certainly important, right? The whole point of this is to kind of show that there is no really clearly defined notion or place that is the West or culture that is Western, but that these categories are still important to consider because they do still reflect something about how the world works, right? So it's possible for us to talk about Westernization or to talk about cultural imperialism without having to have this perfectly agreed upon definition of what the West is. So the implications of transnational feminist cultural studies further suggest that a feminist scholarly or activist agenda needs to be attentive to disparities between women based on location, on nationality, on ethnicity, and citizenship, and also be attentive to difference within those categories, right? So this is to say that transnational feminist cultural studies as a field is relatively apprehensive about misrepresentation or notions of universal womanhood or universal sisterhood unless we're being very strategic about how we deploy those terms, right? So talking about something like women's rights can be a very useful way of getting real progress on material issues that affect women day to day, right? But to kind of engage in those narratives in a way that says that all women are exactly the same and experience oppression exactly the same way and are universally the same and essentially the same would be problematic, right? Transnational feminist cultural studies is really concerned about contexts and how different contexts affect women differently. So turning to the next slide, transnational feminist cultural studies can also be seen as a way of not only analyzing cultural practices, as we've been talking about so far this lecture, but also as a way of reading cultural artifacts or cultural texts, right? To be able to reveal things that aren't super explicit about the inspiration or the context behind the production of that text or that artifact, right? So Gillian Sandel uses this approach in her discussion of the 2001 cult classic film Hedwig and the Angry Inch, which you have reading for this week. So finish this lecture, make sure you do that reading, then come back and kind of think back through what we're talking about here. So in a way, Sandel engages in a reading of the film, right? She takes the film, watches it, and tries to interpret it or read it in a way that one might read a poem, right? But this isn't just some sort of artistic interpretation of the film. This is a scholarly endeavor to locate the film within a particular context and a particular moment of production and of consumption, to help explain why the work is significant beyond what's immediately legible in the film. Moving to the next slide here, slide 14. Here's a little quote that comes out of the abstract for the article. So Sandel writes, focusing on John Cameron Mitchell's 2001 film Hedwig and the Angry Inch, which has been almost universally received as being about transsexuality. This essay argues that the film is equally about transnationality, and specifically about how queer identifications and identities are produced in relation to the nation state. Hedwig explores the limits of national belonging and the pleasures of U.S. popular culture through the lens of sexual and gender identity, with the ambiguity of Hedwig's body embodying confusion about legal, political, and cultural citizenship. So that's a lot going on there. Let's kind of unpack it a bit. So this quote was taken from the abstract of Sandel's paper. You should turn to the last slide, slide 15. And the quote really says so much about her understanding of and use of transnational feminist cultural studies. Now, remember earlier in this lecture, we actually put Sandel's definition of transnational feminist cultural studies up there. But there's a lot of stuff to unpack in this quote. So first off is her reading of transnationalism, right? So her ability to read into this film the role of transnationalism as it plays out, though isn't necessarily immediately obvious in the film, as she kind of makes clear in the article. The movie has been taken up and largely talked about as a film about transsexuality, but she's really trying to highlight how transnationality is not just a theme in the movie, but really is a context in which this movie is made possible. So another thing that we see kind of come through in this abstract and throughout the article is the role of political institutions in structuring experiences of identity, right? So that experiences of gender and of sexuality are structured through experiences of political institutions, including transnational political institutions and national political institutions that defer citizenship to different people. Next thing that we see is this role of Hedwig's body as the embodiment of ambiguity characteristic of the transnational moment in regards to legal, political, and cultural citizenship, right? So even as we see this kind of decreasing or changing role of national borders and of the nation state in determining political, economic, and social and cultural processes and systems and norms, at the same time we see this kind of real concern and crisis over the definition of national identity and over citizenship and over immigration and the perceived threat of immigration, right? And that in a way Hedwig's body kind of embodies all of these concerns, all of these crises, all of these preoccupations within the transnational moment in regards to citizenship and belonging and identity. So ultimately for Sandel, and this quote comes directly from the text, Sandel argues that cultural practices do not simply reflect national or queer identifications, but also produce them, right? So for Sandel, culture isn't simply this world of ideas that influences political and influences the economic from the outside, but it really is this materializing force that culture has real material implications, real embodied effects, right? And isn't simply a world of ideas that can be ignored as one desires, right? So as you engage in your final papers for this course, as you begin to write them, you want to be thinking about transnational feminist cultural studies. In particular, if you're writing about a cultural practice that is happening in a place outside of the geographic borders of the West, then transnational feminist cultural studies is a way of approaching that. Even if you're writing about something within the United States, if you want to write about it as something that's happening at a specifically transnational moment, this is a way of addressing that. Many cultural practices in the United States now nowadays can be interrogated to reveal kind of transnational concerns relating to immigration, relating to global capitalism, relating to wealth, relating to the possibility or the notion of a perceived threat from the outside, even if these things don't appear immediately or on the surface as though they are about transnational issues. In much the same way that Hedwig and the Angry Inch didn't immediately on the surface appear to be about some of these questions that Sandel interrogates and analyzes. Her analysis really does reveal a lot about the significance of the work and about the context in which the work was produced and is continuously being consumed. So make sure to check in on this next lecture, the second lecture for this week, which is about Arabic hip hop and transnational feminist activism. See you soon.